Listeners, beware. This podcast contains themes of the macabre and does not shy away from the details. Our content is graphic and our language is colorful. We might not be your cup of tea, so listener discretion is strongly advised. Tuned in to The Killer Tea, a podcast hosted by two best friends with a proclivity to decipher the deeply demented minds of murderers.
Welcome to Season 2, Episode 4 of The Killer Tea. Today we'll be discussing the Angel of Death, Donald Harvey.
We are your hosts, Christina
and Chelsea.
And we're back.
We're back. We're late, but we're back.
I'm late to life. I'm late to wake up. I'm late to go to bed. So why not just fuck up the podcast while I'm at it?
Oh, yeah. I thought we had another week.
I know.
I don't know why I thought that, but I totally was like, we're not late. And then I was like, oh,
we are just a smidge late. It's okay. It's fine. It's nice. Nobody panic.
Quarantine is melting.
We're probably, this episode that we have is actually gonna be fairly long, I think.
Yes. So this is our gift to you.
We've got a ton of actual legitimate info on this one. So
do you want to set the scene or do you want me to set the scene?
I will set the scene because I think I made you do it twice in a row, but I can't remember.
Okay, go ahead.
So today's episode is going to be about our hometown killer, but I do just want to throw in a trigger warning because there are mentions of sexual assault, abuse, and rape. So, be prepared. Donald Harvey was born on April 15th, 1952 in Butler County, Hamilton, Ohio. I looked that up, and that's like 3 hours away from Boonville, Kentucky. I think it was like an hour and a half away from Cincinnati. But even today, they've got like a residency of less than 100 people. So he was born in the middle of BFE. He was the first of 3 children, but as soon as he was born, his parents basically just moved away to Boonville, Kentucky. And there is this documentation of his parents relaying a story to a author where his mom describes his father holding him at 6 months old, sleeping in the chair. And when he fell asleep, he lost his grip on Donald. And Donald actually fell and had what they assume is a head injury. And the top of his head, the soft spot, didn't actually close. Chelsea, you are a mom of 3. I am a mom of 1. What is the one thing we were all terrified about when our babies were babies?
Oh my God, the soft spot on their heads. I was obsessive over checking my children's soft spot to make sure it wasn't raised or indented or that it was closing.
Well, because the soft spot on a baby's head, if it gets injured, can actually have this entire recourse of bad health things, of trauma to the brain.
Oh, yeah. I mean, that soft spot is basically just an opening in their skull, and their brain is there with just skin covering it. Like, that's it.
They didn't go ahead and, I mean, they may have went to the doctors, but I couldn't find any information if they went and got a certifiable, yes, he suffered a brain injury from this. But it was relayed to the author writing this book on Donald Harvey, and so I felt like it was worth mentioning. And then only a few years after that,
let's just make matters even worse here.
He got a second head injury when he was 5 years old from falling off a truck, and then got this 4-inch gash in his head. It didn't say how deep it was, but if you're getting a 4-inch gash in your tiny little head, I can only imagine that you probably did get some sort of concussion from that kind of impact.
I mean, I would think so. And then they didn't even do any follow-ups. There was no MRIs, CAT scans, EEGs, nothing to make sure that his little brain was okay.
Donald's parents had a somewhat turbulent relationship. It was described by Donald in interviews later as being abusive, but his mother, Goldie Harvey, absolutely refuted this. She said that the kids grew up in a loving home, that her son was a good, sweet boy, and that he had an average life. Now, you do see record of him kind of going back and forth between his parents' house and his grandmother's, and they did separate for some time, but his parents did come back together and they never got divorced. But we do know, regardless, that Donald spent a lot of time at his grandmother's house because there was some sort of volatile relationship going on.
And it's not unusual for children to go and spend time with their grandparents when their parents are going through kind of a rough patch. But unfortunately, in Donald's case, going and staying with his grandmother was not in his best interest, because while under his grandmother's care, his mother's half-brother and Donald's uncle began sexually abusing Donald. And then another year later, the neighbor, who was an adult male named Daniel Thomas, also began abusing Donald. And he had been groomed and conditioned to think that sexual abuse was normal. Donald was actually quoted as saying that he liked Dan and was even paid money for the abusive acts. And this abuse by both men lasted until Donald was 20 years old. If our records are right, and he started spending time with his grandmother at the age of 4, we're talking 16 years of Donald being sexually abused by his uncle and their neighbor.
I wanted to do a little bit more deep diving of what happens to a child's brain when it goes through sexual abuse.
I mean, let's talk about it right now while we're here, while we're talking about 16 years of on and off again abuse and the impact that this would have on a child's brain.
So 1 in 6 men have been sexually abused or assaulted. 16% of boys are sexually abused by the age of 18, with 14% occurring before the age of 18. However, statistically, men are less likely to report abuse than women. So if you take that in account, even these numbers that we have can be construed, because if men aren't coming forward, then it's only talking about the percentage of the men that came forward and not a entirely accurate number of potential victims.
So, I mean, that's a really scary statistic, and maybe one that isn't talked about enough.
This number is gathered by social service agencies, which means that the social services had to get involved, and therefore it is incredibly severe.
This is coming from people where the abuse was so bad that social services had to get involved because the families weren't doing it.
The kicker is that number didn't even consider themselves to be sexually abused. So only 16% of men with the documented histories of sexual abuse even consider themselves to have been sexually abused. Like, that's mind-blowing. And I think, so all of that information was to come to this part, which is, I think that he probably didn't register that he was being sexually abused till he was an adult.
100%.
Here's some more information that I was digging up. So we can shorten childhood sexual abuse to CSA. And while I was pulling up some articles on stuff, the whole thing that I was really looking for was how it affects the development of the brain. So CSA is a risk factor for psychological trauma. I mean, the experts say that psychological trauma impacts the brain in both growth, functionality, and development, and that's in known and unknown ways. It can also be a predictor of lifelong psychopathology.
We've talked about this in previous episodes where we know that a lot of the people that we have covered have been abused in some way or another as children. We've covered that. We know that to be a thing with a lot of these serial killers is childhood trauma and or abuse. So, we're just feeding right back into this. This is how you make a serial killer checklist.
I found an article done on the page Frontiers in Psychology. You might have an easier time reading it than what I do, but
I'm happy to read it if you
yeah,
want.
please do. I mean, I get it. It's just so wordy.
No, I totally understand. So the source of this is from Frontiers in Psychology. This talks a little bit about traumatic brain injuries and childhood sexual assault. There's evidence that the etiological abnormalities of psychological trauma that are caused by CSA and traumatic brain injury, or a TBI. They involve similar neurobiological pathogenies. And then Christina summarized that as saying, I take that to mean that neurobiologists can see similar impacts from childhood sexual abuse trauma as traumatic brain injuries on the brain. The psychological trauma incurred by this experience can lead to PTSD and is often accompanied by devastating functional impairments like depression and anxiety disorders, dissociative disorders, memory and recall impairments, chronic pain, fibromyalgia, myocardial infarction, asthma, diabetes, and even intestinal complications.
So is my summarization correct from that first paragraph that you read? Just curious.
Yes. So I think you did take that correctly. Basically, what scientists are saying is that the brain abnormalities that we see in those who have a traumatic brain injury are very similar to the brains that we see of children that have suffered from sexual abuse. And I don't know if I just said that correctly.
Oh, yeah, you did. It's just crazy to me that someone's brain can look like that because of stress and trauma.
Okay, but let's talk briefly about brain development then. We are one of the few quote unquote animals that are born with our brains not fully developed. And the reason for that is the human brain is so complex that in order for us to make it through the birth canal, our brains would not survive if they were fully developed. That's why our bones are soft. That's why our skulls are not fused. It's all in our biology. So as we're growing and those pathways are developing, similar to a traumatic brain injury where physical force is put on our brain which causes trauma,
stress can do that too.
Stress can do that too. So when you have psychological trauma, those pathways aren't formed either. When we're looking at a TBI versus psychological or sexual abuse, they're very similar.
And they're finding stuff like dissociative disorders. I mean, that falls right into our shit. I
mean, we can look at dissociative disorders. Disassociation is a coping mechanism that people who have incurred trauma often use.
I hope that we were able to simplify it a little bit easier for you guys. And I feel like it's important that this gets talked about so that way when you listen and learn about other true crime, you're able to unpack the people who commit these crimes differently than how you did before.
Right.
It is so easy to fall into somebody is just evil. They were just born evil.
Oh, absolutely. 100%. 100%. I mean, people who are serial killers, such as Donald, if he hadn't experienced that sexual abuse, if he had had a normal upbringing and, hadn't suffered that, or suffered the fall from the truck or being dropped as a baby. And I'm not saying that if you drop your baby, they're going to be a serial killer. No. Like, not at all. These are compounding factors that all happen to the same person. Mm-hmm. And who knows, if these things hadn't happened, even let's say that he fell from the truck and did hit his head, maybe it was the sexual abuse that pushed his brain too far. We don't really know. If these things hadn't happened to Donald, could he have grown up to be a normal, well-respected person in the community? Yeah, maybe. Could he have still been a serial killer? Yeah, maybe. Who knows?
I think, statistically speaking, it would have been highly unlikely that he would have been.
I agree. I think that these things that did happen to him as a child had such an impact on his brain that he did become a serial killer.
Okay, so let's circle back to him being a child and entering into school.
Yes. So we're going way back to Donald's childhood now that we've talked all about this. He didn't think that he was actually being sexually abused. He was abused until he was the age of 20. And there's actually a quote by his school principal to the Cincinnati Post that said, Donnie was a very special child to me. He was always clean and well-dressed with his hair trimmed. He was a happy child, very sociable, and well-liked by the other children. He was a handsome boy with big brown eyes and dark curly hair. He always had a smile for me. There was never any indication of abnormality. That's what his principal said. But his peers had a
But the
different
different view makes a lot of sense to me. His peers described him as being this loner who hated sports and was kind of a daydreamer and kept to himself. He was described as a teacher's pet. And even the kids, because he was slightly effeminate and was very hyper-focused on his looks, they would call him a sissy and, other stupid shit kids do. Donald would go on to do well in school, but ultimately decide that he wanted to drop out at 15 years old before entering into the 10th grade. However, this didn't mean that he wasn't a good student.
He wasn't stupid. By 16, he actually received a diploma from the correspondence school the same year. So within a year of leaving school, he got his diploma.
I had to actually research what a correspondence school was because I thought that was like distance learning, but it's not. A correspondence school was something that they did whenever the teacher would assign homework, mail it out to you. You would do it at your own pace and mail it back in. So it wasn't happening in like real time. I mean, obviously it wasn't happening in real time because they didn't have distance learning in the same effect that we have it now. But I was still like, what the fuck is a correspondence school?
But I mean, that's pretty amazing though, that if he went to a correspondence school instead of regular school, that he managed to receive his diploma within a year. He must have been hustling.
I knew from my grandparents, right, that both of them had a 9th grade education and that was as far as they went.
Right.
And this was kind of their era. So I asked my grandma, why did you drop out of high school? And she said at that time it wasn't considered dropping out. It was called early leaving. And that was, half of the people that she knew, that's what they did.
Yeah.
Around the time that he was in school, so the 1950s, only 58% of students dropped out by the 9th grade. And by the 1960s, it was 27%. And to me, that number is absolutely like unfathomable because I think I know one person who dropped out of high school, and today the statistic is about 7%.
I mean, it's also very different times, though, too.
Oh, yeah. I mean, the 50s, you had the Cold War and all
Kids
that.
were leaving to go to the war. Kids were leaving to work and help their families. Whereas today, now, like, you can't do anything without a high school diploma, so.
At 16, Donald had his first consensual sexual experience after meeting someone at his factory job. So he graduated. Factory jobs were aplenty in the 50s, so that's what he went to.
He actually ended up beginning his first relationship at the age of 17 with James Peluso. And he actually ended up being with James on and off again for the better part of 15 years.
Now, this on-again, off-again relationship thing that he does is going to be a pattern you see throughout his life. With every relationship he has, he seems to just, what Chelsea and I used to call, recycle.
You recycle the people that you were dating.
There was several people that he just seemed to bounce back and forth between. And I don't know if he had attachment problems or if it was the times. I don't know. But I just thought that was interesting that there was so many people he repeatedly went back and forth to. A little fact. All right. Shit starts getting real.
Yeah.
It starts getting real.
As if shit wasn't real enough. Here we go.
So in 1970, when he's 18 years old, Donald loses his job at the factory for undisclosed reasons. And now he's unemployed, running out of money. He doesn't really have a place to stay. And his mother gives him a phone call and is like, hey, please go visit your grandmother at the Marymount Hospital in London, Kentucky. She's not doing well. She could really use the visit. Well, that's exactly what he does. But while he stays there visiting his grandmother, he actually charms the nuns who run the hospital, and they end up offering him a job because they think he's so amazing.
And at this point, Donald really doesn't have anything better to do, and he needs a job. So he's like, sure, let's do that.
Well, whatever he was doing, you did not have to have any. And again, this was the 70s. So
yes. Times
different.
are very, very different between what you're allowed to do now and what you were allowed to do then. It's called the scope of practice, and that changes with the times, I guess. Irregardless, he started working at Marymount on May 11th of 1970.
Which was the very next day after talking to the nuns.
Yeah. So, no background checks or anything.
He gets this fresh start at this hospital. And then within 2 weeks of getting his job there, he was living with this man named Randy White. And Randy actually raped him very shortly after getting his job at the hospital. And I can't help but to wonder if this was Donald's breaking point, because it snowballs. Donald himself fucking snowballs after this. And it could very well be that he's in this hospital with people who cannot defend themselves, and maybe he's being opportunistic, or he just fucking loses his shit and finally wants to have control over something in his life. And I don't know. But shit starts happening now. All right, so on May 30th, 1970, Donald committed his first murder just 3 weeks after starting at the hospital.
See, and this makes me think that him being raped made him snap.
There wasn't an exact date of the rape, but we know that it happened between the murder and when he first got hired there.
Yeah.
So I don't know. But he smothered an 88-year-old patient with a sheet of blue plastic and a pillow. He placed the plastic over the victim's mouth in order to kind of quicken the suffocation up a bit, but also to prevent any fibers from entering the victim's lungs. So that way, if any sort of autopsy or investigation was done, that it wouldn't raise any suspicions. That
takes some forethought.
I mean, maybe he really just is that smart. Maybe he really is. There's indications that he is just that smart. I can't imagine 18-year-old me thinking that, like having that knowledge.
Well, to make it worse, he used a stethoscope to listen to the patient's heart until he was dead. That is some fucked up shit.
So this is kind of the birth of his modus operandi. He disposed of the plastic and then started cleaning up the body, like bathing it. He bathed the body.
That does surprise me a smidge, because if you've never been around a dead body that has recently died, your body does release fluids when you die. I mean, it just happens. It's a part of death.
Chelsea, you were a CNA, right?
Yes. Which, okay. So there is a difference between orderlies and CNAs. A CNA is a certified nursing assistant, and you actually have to have like state training and pass an exam to be a CNA. So traditionally, orderlies are kind of like what a CNA would do, I suppose, but slightly different. In Christina's notes, she has that orderlies were responsible for janitorial and patient care services, so ensuring that medical equipment is properly sterilized, cleaning the rooms, changing bed sheets, transporting patients, and helping them move around, basic assistance with everyday tasks.
They're caregivers.
Yes, they are caregivers. Now, a certified nursing assistant is responsible for a little bit more than that. They're not really responsible for the cleaning and janitorial part.
Regardless, it sounds to me like you have to be someone who's legitimately invested in helping people to want to take on this position.
Oh, 100%. It's not an easy position. Being a CNA is what made me realize that I didn't want to go into nursing. As a CNA, part of our job was to clean up the patient after they had passed away. That's part of your job, is making sure they're cleaned up and in clean clothes.
Okay. Well, so then that also tells me that it's probably a very stressful position. Is it a stressful position?
Oh, it's an incredibly stressful position.
Are you seeing death a lot in that situation?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, well, it depends on where you're working. Like, I worked in a nursing home and with home health care. So I saw a lot of death because I worked with the very elderly and sickly population. Now, if you're working, it depends on what floor you're working in. Like if you're working in the ICU as a CNA, you're probably going to see a lot of death. If you're working in the nursing home, you become very attached to your patients and the residents. So
in your experience, and now this obviously is going to be like confirmation bias. It does not represent the other populations of other places. But just in your experience, was it common to like one a week that someone would pass away? Was it less? Was it more?
It was less than that. I mean, I worked at a nurse. Now, granted, this was years ago, and I didn't work there for a very long time. Like it wasn't one of my longer jobs. But no. And we pretty much knew when someone was going to go. It wasn't very often that it was like a shock or sudden, a surprise.
Gotcha.
Like we kind of, they would go downhill. And when you work in that environment, you kind of start to recognize the signs.
Okay, gotcha.
But that whole death comes in 3 thing, once someone passed away, we always were like mentally prepping ourselves for 2 more.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay. So I just wanted to ask, just to kind of like, I mean, it's relative, it's related to what's going on.
Everyone's situations and experiences may be different. That's just my experience as an 18-year-old working in a nursing home.
Yeah, that's why I wanted to ask, because it was similar to Donald.
Yeah, I mean, I worked as a CNA right out of high school for a couple years, and I remember being in the nursing home, and the nurses would always be like, "Oh, they're going downhill. I think they're gonna go." Like the nurses always knew.
Well, in this circumstance, he really wasn't afraid that he was going to get caught, and he went about his business as usual and notified the nurses. The very next day, he murdered his second victim. What? The very next day. Like,
oh my God. So how he killed the patient is horrible. He used the wrong size catheter. So instead of, there are male and female catheters, and they are very, very different. Mm-hmm. And you cannot use a female catheter on a male. Mm-hmm. It would be horrific. So instead of using a male-sized catheter, he used a female one. The length of a male urethra is 18 to 20 centimeters, and the length of a female urethra is 3 to 4 centimeters. So this means that a female catheter is much shorter than a male one. So a male catheter is approximately 30 to 40 centimeters long, and a female catheter between 7 and 20 centimeters long. Maybe he did accidentally make this mistake and didn't know there was a difference. But on the same hand, like, I could only see that happening if he had no training. Did he start working with no training? Were they training him as they went along? I don't understand.
I mean, I had a friend's mom, so a friend who's 20 years my senior, their mom, who worked as a nurse in England in the 70s, say that, yes, she was doing catheters. And then I had a slew of other people saying that it was in the United States, so it's done state by state. And there was a lot of mixed.
Yeah, I mean, each state does have their own rules on what you can and cannot do. I know for myself that in 2007, 2008, 2009, I was not doing catheters. I knew how to clean them. I knew how to empty the bags. And I knew approximately how they went in and out, but I never did one. That was the nurse's job.
Honestly, I don't know. I would think that it would be intentional, but...
Well, either way, the patient realizes that something's wrong, obviously. And, I mean, if you've never had a catheter, they're not exactly comfortable. So the patient realizes something's wrong and demands Donald to stop, but Donald doesn't stop and used the heel of his hand to control his victim till he vomited blood and died.
He reports this as being an accident. And how do you still call it an accident if you are then trying to control them and kill them? How was that an accident?
No, it's not an accident. He is just a fucking moron.
Yeah.
And I think, honestly, he was just experimenting to see what would happen. That's my thought. That's my thought process. I would think that he is probably experimenting to see what kind of pain he can inflict. So I'm really curious, like, how he managed to pass this one off, because he still, there's no record or anything that he got in
There
trouble
wasn't an
for this.
investigation, and that is something that you're going to see repeated throughout this entire process. Is there is a lack of investigation. At 3 weeks, he killed 2 people, and then less than a month after that, he committed his first self-proclaimed mercy kill, which a 42-year-old patient told him that she wished to die. She was praying for death, and he turned her oxygen levels down so low it eventually did end her life. And then another nurse found her 4 hours later.
Why isn't the nurse wondering why her oxygen levels were so
Did he
low?
pop back in and turn it up to what it was supposed to be at the last? Like, I don't get that.
I don't know. I really
Can
don't
I
understand.
ask you about the 4 hours later thing? Does that sound appropriate? I don't know what that would be like.
I don't know. I mean, maybe. It depends. Like, was he on a long-term care floor? Because if so, yeah, I could maybe see that happening. And by long-term care, I mean like a nursing floor type home. I don't know. It's hard to say
this was when they
because
were still at the hospital, and I don't know if these people were receiving end-of-life care, if it was like a hospice.
Well, that's what I mean. Like, is this long-term care? I mean, because you can have long-term care floors within a hospital. I have heard of that.
Okay.
And long-term care is very similar to like a nursing home
Okay.
or a hospice. So, I don't know. It's weird. I mean, I don't know that I ever went 4 hours without entering one of my residents' rooms.
Right now, we've got 3 murders and no investigation, 3 deaths and no investigation into them after all being under the same care of the same orderly who had only been there for a month and like a week.
Yeah, that is insanely suspicious. I mean, having 3 people die pretty close together isn't all that suspicious because, you know, death does tend to happen in threes. But to have, I mean, I know if I had been working and 3 patients or residents had died that I was directly involved with, they would have been questioning me on what did I do? How did I do this? How did I do that? I mean, that's very, very suspicious. So he was either one hell of a charmer or just wasn't documenting that he was the one taking care of them. I don't know.
Yeah, because everything probably would have been penciled in at that point.
Yeah, I mean, documentation is everything when you're in the medical field, and if you don't document it, it didn't happen.
Well, 3 weeks later, he'd go and he'd kill again. This time, he intentionally turned a 43-year-old patient on his side, knowing that he was not supposed to. And because there was so much fluid buildup in this guy's lungs, it actually caused him to drown on his own fluids. So Harvey played it off. He informed a nurse that the patient looked really bad, but she said, you know what, go ahead, continue with your routine. So he proceeded to bathe him after he was dead, knowing that he was dead, in order to avoid suspicion. And this actually, I guess this confirms that the hospital was not a ethical place because they actually covered it up. And then for his remaining time at Marymount, the doctors would tease him, and the doctors and nurses that would tease him that he was bathing a dead man. Now, I listened and watched a lot of videos where people were very bitter about this statement, but from my experience of growing up with people who have been nurses and that, I understand that this is a coping mechanism, and I wouldn't hold it against anyone for that kind of morbid sense of humor because I get it.
Yeah, I mean, when you are a nurse and you see so much of death and you're working in the medical field, you do tend to find humor in things that aren't necessarily funny. Mm-hmm. I mean, when I worked at a nursing home, you know, we worked with a lot of people who had dementia and Alzheimer's, and you know, it's not funny, but we used to find humor in little things because if you didn't, you would kind of lose it a little bit.
You deteriorate.
I mean,
humor is a
I
coping mechanism.
got attacked by one of my favorite residents who had dementia with her walker. Like, she was hitting me with her walker because she was trying to escape the nursing home because she didn't want to be there.
Angel.
I mean, and it was really sad. And she was calling me every name in the book. And she was a very, very sweet lady when she wasn't losing her cookies. But, you know, she was mad at me and was literally like, I was against the door, like standing like a star, trying to keep her from getting out the door as she's ramming her walker into me, calling me a bitch and a cunt and every fucking word that she could come up with. And she's like this tiny little old lady that we all used to call Nana. And
oh, bless her.
I mean, I loved her to death and she was wonderful, but you know, that was a crappy situation that we all laughed about later because what else are you going to do?
And I get it. So I just brought that up because I'm not going to criticize the hospital and their staff for that. I mean, I'll criticize them for everything else because let's be real.
For all they knew, he said, the patient doesn't look very good. They said, go ahead and continue to bathe him. They didn't know that he had killed him.
Yeah.
From their point of view, you know, it's a patient that is obviously very, very sick. And he's saying they don't look very good. You know, for all they know, the patient was dead when Harvey went in there and he didn't know the difference between a live body and a dead body.
It's business as usual.
Right. So they're making fun of him for not being able to recognize the difference. They're not making fun of him for killing someone and then bathing them. They're making fun of him for not being able to tell the difference between a live and a dead body.
So 2 days after that, on accident, he used a faulty gas tank on a patient, and the patient had a heart attack and died. So I'm assuming when they say gas tank, they mean oxygen?
Well, not necessarily.
Not necessarily?
It could have been laughing gas, too.
Okay. Well,
because that's a thing. But if it was faulty and he didn't know that, then no, that technically
so 12 days after that, he committed his first premeditated murder.
Now, this I call bullshit because he used plastic to murder the first guy. And that
this is his first self-admitted premeditated murder.
Yeah. One of his patients, Ben, had knocked Donald unconscious with a urinal and poured feces and urine over him, claiming that he thought Donald was a burglar. Okay, so this makes me think that this patient isn't all with it, as that sometimes happens.
I didn't include his age in the notes, but I'm pretty sure he was in his late 80s.
Yeah, so he probably didn't have all his wits about him. So Donald was obviously furious over this and came up with a plot for revenge, which you don't seek revenge on patients who have dementia and Alzheimer's because they don't know what they are doing.
Yeah.
So he went back and used the method of his second murder where he inserted a female-sized catheter into Ben. However, he then, he straightened out a coat hanger and shoved the wire through the catheter about 2 feet, puncturing his bladder and his bowel.
Oh my God. That is so, that has got to be one of the worst ways to die. Like, what? I mean, obviously, so Ben went into shock. He's breaking out into a cold sweat. He falls into a coma. Donald disposed of the coat wire and then replaced the wrong catheter with the right catheter. And he's doing all this to cover his tracks. But of course, things like sepsis and all of that sets in. Ben got gnarly infections and he died.
Well, yeah. I mean, if you puncture your bowel, you're leaking feces into your body cavity. Mm-hmm. Like, it's a very serious situation. And if they didn't know that was happening, I mean, there's no way for them to know that was happening without knowing what had happened. Mm-hmm. And, you know, that's going to kill you fairly quickly, unfortunately.
I mean, it's just a horrible way to murder someone. It really is. It's just a horrible way.
It's a really horrible way to murder somebody.
While Donald was still 18, he entered into a long-term sexual relationship with a married man named Vernon Midden, who actually had children, and he was a professional undertaker. So I'm going to call this a match made in hell because this guy is like 30 years Donald's senior. Him's a grown ass man.
He's 48. He's 48 years old.
Adult is then teaching Donald how different types of death actually look in a body post-mortem. So this essentially is teaching Donald how to be a better murderer.
So
What
basically, he's teaching Donald how to avoid getting caught for his
And in
murders.
that respect, I feel like some responsibility lays on his shoulders, because had he done the appropriate thing, which would have been going to the fucking police and, you know, not helping this 18-year-old kid become a better killer, things may have turned out differently.
Oh, absolutely. He knows right from wrong, but he's also being taught how to be a better killer. Because I think if he hadn't been involved with Vernon, eventually he would have gotten caught.
You meet this 18-year-old kid and you're like, hey, baby, let me take you down to the morgue and teach you how to be a better killer. Like, you're a fucked up individual.
We know why. Vernon was also involved in the occult, which we have talked about in the past, about Satanism in the occult, and how Satanism doesn't necessarily make you a bad person. But in this fucking instance,
Whenever I heard that he was in the occult, I readied myself to talk and give this big long speech, because they keep labeling the occult as this big bad devil worshipping thing, and it is absolutely not that at all whatsoever. Most of the time. 90% of the time, that is not what the occult is.
It's a catch-all term for anyone that isn't Christian or follow an Abrahamic religion, which there are many non-Abrahamic religions
As
out
you,
there.
the responsible podcast listener who loves stuff about true crime and occasionally comes across murderers who are labeled as satanic, you now have this information to carry with you for the rest of your life, and know that that the occult is not synonymous with devil worship, and Wiccans and witches are not synonymous with devil worship. It's just these particular demented pieces of human garbage. Okay, That's me off my high horse. I'm done. I just wanted to make sure that we stopped painting Wiccans and pagans with the same brush. Okay, anyways, so Vernon is also involved in the occult, and he introduces Donald to this, but he doesn't actually let him participate. And the reason why he's not allowed to participate is because he's not a member of their coven. He's not part of their circle. He's not in the group. And I just wanted to take the opportunity to say that this is not unusual. It's not alluding to anything. If you're not part of the practicing religion that you're witnessing, you're not allowed to perform a sacred rite or a ritual.
But it's the same way. I mean, if you're not Catholic, you don't take Holy Communion with
That
other
is
Catholics.
the best way to put it. So yes, you are absolutely correct. I only bring that to the table to help you, the viewer, understand that it's not like some top secret Illuminati type thing, which is kind of how it's been alluded to when other people talk about it. And I just want to squash that. Okay, circling back to Donald and Vernon. Their relationship ultimately ends after 7 months for undisclosed reasons. Donald was devastated and he became very, very depressed. He actually began to fantasize about killing Vernon with embalming fluid while Vernon was still alive. But he didn't have the balls to do it, and he didn't do it.
You know, fantasizing about killing your ex.
As you do.
But he was actually almost caught when a maintenance man was called to clear out a blockage in one of the patient's toilets, where he discovered a hypodermic needle. But Donald was never questioned about it. However, he was let go from the hospital on March 27th of 1971, which was about 2 weeks later. They didn't disclose a reason.
We know why.
Kind of not hard
And this,
to guess.
to me, I think the hospital is saving their ass. Of course, unsubstantiated claim. Just throwing that out there. But 2 weeks later, if they find this, and then Donald's been involved in all these other little accidental deaths, I mean, they knew.
Maybe the hospital was like, hey, something's not quite right here.
We didn't touch on this at the beginning, but Donald has a fuck ton of victims. Like a fuck ton.
He does.
And while we kind of went through a small list, I mean, I hate to say a small list, but we went through a list of people to kind of give you an idea of how it started and the methods that he was using, because that kind of continues on. But unfortunately, we don't have enough time to go over every single one of his victims. What you need to know is that Donald was able to continue killing without suspicion for 10 months while he was employed at that hospital. That led to a total of 15 people that he murdered, with a rotation of the same kind of technique, which was lowering oxygen, suffocation, overdoses of morphine, and even arsenic poisoning. Just know that he killed a fuck ton of people, and there was not proper investigation done to stop him.
Honestly, I think that's why the hospital just fired him and didn't disclose his activities to the police, because the hospital would have then gotten in trouble for not investigating all these weird random deaths involving Donald.
It's my unsubstantiated opinion that Donald, his killing was his only method of control. He had no control over his life. He had no control over what was happening to him.
Well, you have to remember, he's still being sexually abused.
Yeah, he's still being sexually abused. So I think that killing offered him a sense of power and control that he desperately needed. And so now it was kind of like a drug to him. Now it's been ripped away. And I guarantee you he was probably at his wit's end with panic, because this had been a constant source to feed his dying ego and all of the stuff, his insecurities and everything. And now it was just cut off. So I think that he desperately craved that power again. And you know, whenever March 1971 rolled around, he was having a breakdown. Donald was distraught and drunk himself into a stupor. He attempted to commit burglary at his own apartment complex and was even arrested. And then during that time, he drunkenly confessed to his murders, to those 15 murders, while under police custody, but his confession wasn't taken seriously.
Of course it wasn't, because we see this as a pattern of
drunk, belligerent, guy that had never committed. He had no track record whatsoever, and obviously he hadn't been picked up for the murders that he'd done. So they just thought he was drunk and losing his shit. But if somebody confesses to murdering 15 patients, you're not gonna. I don't know, man.
Once again, we're seeing the lack of
follow-up.
I hate to dump on the police, but on police follow-up.
Mm-hmm.
June of 1971, he ends up setting fire to a vacant apartment's bathroom where he lived, and he did this in an attempt to commit suicide.
Yeah, he was hoping to be able to inhale the fumes or whatever.
Yeah. So he's depressed. He doesn't have his outlet, which murdering at this point has become, his drug of choice.
Mm-hmm.
And he didn't know how to murder people and get away with it without working at a hospital. He ends up pleading guilty to a lesser charge of petty theft and was fined a whole $50. The judge did recommend he seek psychiatric treatment, but did not order him into treatment. And so Donald paid his fine and went on his merry way.
People just didn't look at mental illness the same way that we do now, both on a personal level, a professional level, and a clinical level. So I'm not surprised. I don't think that was going to go any other way than the one it did. I mean, I do wish that somebody had at least investigated what this guy was saying, but I'm not surprised. After being released, he moves in with a family and has his first heterosexual encounter with a neighbor woman, Ruth Ann Hodges. There's some conflicting information whether or not she's a neighbor or the daughter. I don't know. Let's just say daughter. And he claims that he was just like, you know what? We'll give ladies a try. He had to be drunk to do it, and he does not remember much other than waking up and then being naked together. And then allegedly 9 months later, she gave birth to a boy whom she named Donald. Now, Donald himself, not Donald the child, never really talks about his children cohesively. So he's never been active in their lives. And sometimes he goes from mentioning them in interviews to just outright ignoring that they even exist. So Donald as a father is not a father. He just,
No.
This was just a consequence of trying out heterosexuality. That's all it is.
In mid-June of 1971, Donald actually goes and enlists in the Air Force. And, maybe he was hoping for the extremely disciplined routine of military life and was hoping that it would straighten him out. Or maybe he was doing it to escape having a bastard child. But either way, the military life wasn't for him. And he ended up being discharged from the Air Force less than a year later. And there's some conflicting stories as to what led to his discharge. Mm-hmm. Some said he tried to commit suicide via NyQuil, and others were loose-lipped that Donald had told others of his murder confession.
I don't know which one I side with more.
I would think that if he was confessing to murders in the military would have looked into it. Mm-hmm. I mean, I'm giving the military a lot of credit here, but I would hope that they would have looked into it.
I think you're right, because it wouldn't have been their problem. It was like it wouldn't have been something that he did while he was in the military. So I think if we're even going to say that the military covers up stuff, in this circumstance, they wouldn't have anything to cover up.
Right. I'm almost more apt to say that he was talking about wanting to commit suicide. And in the military, I mean, especially during this time, there wasn't a lot of tolerance for mental illness. I mean, you can't join the military if you are mentally ill. So maybe they were just like, he's not stable enough for the military. He needs to go.
By 1972, Donald had moved back to Kentucky and in with his parents, clearly depressed and very disappointed at how his life had turned out and obviously mentally unwell. He tried to commit suicide using sedatives. Now, Donald was never in the line of fire. He didn't see active warfare. So these suicide attempts aren't correlating to any PTSD he got from his brief time in the military. He was only there for a little less than a year and was pretty fresh out of boot camp. However, he did get treated for his suicide attempt, got his stomach pumped at the VA hospital, which I thought was unusual.
It could have been that he was medically discharged and it wasn't a dishonorable discharge, because...
So as long as it's not a dishonorable discharge, they can still go to the VA hospital?
Yes. So, my husband has a medical discharge from the Air Force, mm-hmm. and so he can still go to the VA to receive any care that he needs, even though he was discharged. So the only time that you kind of lose your benefits, quote unquote, is if you're dishonorably discharged.
Things start looking up for Donald. He finally found consensual sexual relationships where he is equal to his partner and was free of the long-term abuse from his uncle and his neighbor. He had started dating. He took a job at Cardinal Hill Convalescent Hospital in Lexington, Kentucky. He worked there for 5 months full-time and another 2 years part-time. He had a few long-term relationships and did not kill anyone for these few years. So he returned to a state of normalcy, as much as a murderer possibly can. But then his messings or dealings with the occult kind of escalated, and he was initiated into the Church of Satan. But he was initiated using a ritual that's only supposed to be done by heterosexual couples.
Yeah, so to make that less confusing,
it's a swap.
Two couples just swap their female partners and they have sex with each other.
Now, this resulted in him knocking up his satanic partner.
Oh my God.
So he got a second child out of this.
What a story. Mommy, Daddy, where did I come from? Well, you see, I was doing this ritual to get initiated into the Church of Satan. And I was sleeping with this other man, and here you are.
Who was gay.
Who was gay, and here you are.
So during this initiation, he received a spiritual guide named Duncan, who would allegedly go on to assist him in picking victims. Supposedly, Duncan was a motherfucking doctor.
Talk about going against your oath of practice.
This shit got so weird.
I will do no harm.
So fast. 0 to 100. What the fuck? So by 1980, Donald had started a serious relationship with this dude named Doug Hill. After quarreling, Donald made his first attempt on human life since leaving the hospital because they had a fight.
He poisoned Doug's ice cream.
Ice cream is sacred and it should never be poisoned. What kind of fucking monster poisons ice cream?
Donald, apparently.
I found my line in the sand and it's poisoning ice cream. That's just too far.
Luckily, he didn't end up killing Doug and they just broke up.
And then shortly after, he meets and falls in love with Carl Hohler. The two eventually move in together. I mean, I say eventually, but all this happened really, really fast because this is like what, the second or third person Donald had a long-term relationship with in 1980. But yeah. So they get together and it wasn't long before they started fighting because Donald found out that Carl was unfaithful and eventually Donald caught him. In retaliation, he decided to poison him with arsenic on Sundays so that way he would get really sick and stay home instead of going and having sex with other men because Sundays was his day to play.
So Carl also had a female best friend who Donald didn't like and even tried to poison with acrylic acid, hepatitis B, and HIV. Luckily, none of this worked.
And those diseases didn't take either. So she didn't get hepatitis B or HIV.
Thank God, because oh my God, what a fucking monster.
How fucked up is that?
And there was even a female neighbor that Donald and Carl had, and he felt that this neighbor was too invested in his and Carl's affairs. So he poisoned her with arsenic by serving her a plate of leftovers laced with it, and then gave her a jar of mayonnaise and a pie laced with arsenic as well. Ultimately, this did end up killing her and ended up sickening many of her family members, but Donald was not investigated. Because, you know,
she had a pre-existing condition, which is what they wrote it off as. But then nobody paid attention when the entirety of her family got really sick as well.
Carl's parents began fighting with Donald, and he decides, I'm going to finish them off as well. So Henry Howler died 4 days later due to a stroke and kidney failure. And he attempted to poison Carl's mother over the period of a year, but she luckily did not get sick enough to pass away and ended up getting better.
This part here is fucking nuts to me. So Donald did accidentally cause Carl to kill his own brother-in-law. How, you ask? Donald had supposedly been using methanol, commonly called wood alcohol, to remove labels from jars. I don't know why he was removing labels from jars, but that's what he was doing. And he kept the methanol in a vodka bottle.
As you do.
Did he put it with all their other alcohol? Like, this might be an accident, but it kind of sounds like he was maybe hoping that he was going to eventually poison Carl. But regardless, so one day, Donald's gone, and Carl's brother-in-law comes over. Carl and him are having a good time, and he gives him a shot of vodka, unknowingly served him the methanol, and he died a week later. He's fought and was in excruciating pain that entire week.
Oh, yeah. I mean, when you talk about alcohol, that's not the alcohol that we drink. It is highly, highly poisonous. You cannot drink methanol. It's not okay.
I don't know. I can't think of what it would smell like, but wouldn't they? Or maybe, I mean, I always smell my shots before I take them because I'm a glutton for punishment, but maybe other people don't.
Either way, if it was because of this or not, Carl ended their relationship pretty quickly after that. They did continue to have somewhat of an on-again, off-again toxic love, and once Donald grew furious and poisoned Carl. While it didn't take his life, he did end up in the hospital. So they break up, but they keep going back and forth on if they're going to be together or not.
It just had to be a toxic-ass situation is my only guess.
Yeah. And then Donald, instead of just like going a separate way, decides, I'm just going to poison him. Like, what the fuck?
Yep.
The fuck?
Yep. So by 1985, Donald was still working at the VA hospital and had claimed several more victims. Some he calls mercy kills, others he says it's an accident. I don't believe that for a fucking second, but oh well. One was an ex-boyfriend. One was even Carl's former landlord, who Donald decided to go ahead and kill because the landlord accused Carl of cheating him on his utility bills. So I don't know what that could mean, a couple different things, but regardless, he didn't want Carl to feel humiliated, so he went ahead and fucking poisoned him. And shortly after that, he was awarded a promotion at work where he got to be in charge of the VA's morgue.
How ironic.
What the fuck? What the fuck? That's some twisted irony right there.
And if you thought shit couldn't get any weirder, oh, it does.
Oh,
so now let's just recap. So Donald is murdering people left and right.
Yeah, he's
Donald
at 30 victims at this point,
Yeah.
maybe more.
Donald is now a member of the Church of Satan.
Mm-hmm.
And now Donald goes ahead and joins a known socialist Nazi party in order
to destroy it from the
inside and poison its members.
What the fuck? Our hero.
Oh my God. But before he could actually go through with his plan of poisoning all these people, he was apprehended by the VA hospital security team after they discovered a pistol, hypodermic needles, a small specimen of liver mounted in paraffin wax to be sliced with a microtome for microscopic examination, a cocaine spoon, a biography about a serial killer, and 2 books on Satanism in his gym bag.
So there's a lot there. And before I start unpacking my theories, I do want to commentate on the small specimen of liver. I kind of wonder if he took that from someone that he had been poisoning and wanted to see if it showed up, if the arsenic showed up in their liver.
Could be.
That's my best guess.
Or my other wonder is, was this liver contaminated with some sort of disease that he was hoping to poison others with?
He swore blind, Donald swore blind, that the cocaine spoon and gun were planted in his bag by his ex-boyfriend, Carl. At this point in time, they're ex-boyfriends. Nothing has shown us thus far that he used a gun. When they investigated his house, there was no other guns. So, I mean, it very well could have been planted, but like the other stuff does not sound like it was planted. That sounds like just Donald.
But the kicker is the VA didn't even investigate anymore due to his clean record.
Yeah.
This is fun.
So on February 24th, 1986, he began a new job as a nurse's aide at yet another new hospital. No questions were raised about how his ass got fired from all those other previous jobs. And while he didn't start killing right away, the murders did eventually pick up again. We were doing the same kind of routine. Poison, smother, all that stuff. His satanic spirit guide, Mr. Duncan, would help him pick his victims from this hospital.
And here's the even bigger kicker. During this time,
oh God,
his boss gave him a glowing performance review.
Yes.
Like, are you fucking kidding me?
You got like 4 out of 5 on a bunch of stuff and then 5s on things. Like, what the fuck, man?
I don't understand.
I hope that, it's easy. It's easy when you're on the outside looking in to be so critical. I hope that if I'm ever, God forbid I ever am, in any sort of circumstance where I have evidence in front of me, that I'm more responsible with it. I hope.
Yeah, I hope so too.
Okay.
That leads us to November of 1986. Donald decides to be a big boy and enter therapy to help him to cope with his breakup from Carl. Not the dozens of murders. Just the breakup.
But that breakup's hitting him real hard, Chelsea. It's hitting him real hard.
Oh my God. However, this offered little help and Donald attempted suicide yet again, this time by veering his car off the top of a mountain road. It didn't work, but he did get another head injury.
What even is this life? What even is this man?
So we're up to 4 or 5 suicide attempts. He's really, if he is that good at killing, you'd think he'd be able to kill himself.
It's almost like his heart really isn't in it because he knows all these super easy ways. His
heart really isn't in it. Oh my God.
Sorry. Was that too fucked up?
No. His heart's really not in on his own suicide attempt.
He knows all these other ways to commit murders that he gets away with it. And you're telling me he can't, like, insert oxygen into his own vein with one of those hypodermic needles that he has?
One of the ways he was killing people was by overdosing them on morphine. Why didn't he just overdose himself?
Because, like I said,
on morphine.
He was just giving it the college try. He was not committed.
Not committed to the murder of himself.
I promise I'm only slightly a garbage human. But we are talking about a man who killed 80 people, so I'll take it.
Finally, on March 8th of 1987, an autopsy was performed on one of his victims. How we made it to 1987, because we're talking, 17 years of murdering people? Mm-hmm. We're finally at one autopsy. The autopsy was performed by Dr. Lee Lehman, a forensic psychologist with a background in biochemistry, who knew specifically about cyanide. He cut open John Powell and immediately smelled the smell of bitter almonds, which is what cyanide smells like, if you didn't know, and knew the victim had been poisoned. After sending out 3 samples to 3 other labs and his suspicions were confirmed, the police were finally involved in a full-fledged investigation began. During this investigation, several members of staff came forward with their own personal suspicions, rumors, and all were leads that pointed to Donald. Police asked the nursing home staff to participate in a lie detector test, all of which agreed, even Donald.
But he called in sick the day of the test because, that works. That's definitely going to deter someone from giving you a lie detector test, especially when they suspect murder.
The police, didn't buy this attempt and brought Donald in for a formal interview. And during this time, he confessed to mercy killing the victim. Mercy killing with cyanide.
This is the last victim. Well, no, it's not even the last victim. He killed John Powell and then he killed someone immediately, like the next day. But John was the one who actually got the autopsy. So it's not even technically his last victim. But he's saying, it was a mercy killing. I know, I felt so bad for him. I felt so bad for his family. And I just couldn't take it anymore. And I decided to mercy kill him.
Yeah. So a month later, in April of 1987, he was indicted for aggravated first-degree murder. And he was only 34 years old. I think this might be one of the youngest serial killers that we've talked about.
I mean, he was 18 and already had like 15 people to his roster.
I think he might be one of the youngest. Richard Trenton Chase was pretty young. Mm-hmm. But, I mean, to be caught at 34, I think all of our other big ones were in their 40s and 50s, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, he might very well be the most prolific serial killer of the time. I mean, we'll get to his final body count at the end, but so May 26, 1987, a competency hearing was conducted by Dr. Can't even say your motherfucking name, not even gonna try. And
I'm gonna try it. Hold on, let me try it. Schmidt-Gosling.
Dr. Smitty. And George Fisher, a clinical psychologist. So Roger Fisher, did I say George? Oh my God.
You said George.
Roger Fisher, a clinical psychologist, found that Harvey knew the difference between wrong and he had the faculties to adhere to our laws. So Dr. Smitty also stated that he believed that Donald was free of any emotional disease or defect of the mind, and I frankly call bullshit on that. Dr. Smitty concluded that Donald had a history of depression because of childhood experiences, but he was not and had never been psychotic. All right, Chelsea, what do you think about the APD, the psychotic?
Okay.
What do you think?
To be fair, in the 80s, APD wasn't a thing yet. They are looking at his childhood experiences and saying that, yes, these caused him depression. I'm actually pretty proud of them because they're saying he's not psychotic. because psychopathy was kind of used as a broad paintbrush in the 50s and 60s, which we know.
It's nice to not hear someone be called
Schizophrenic
for once.
Yes. So we didn't know as much about traumatic brain injuries at this point. That is a fairly
that's
recent,
a very new thing.
That is very recent. So I'm actually pretty proud of them for saying, yeah, he has a history of depression, but no, he's not psychotic. He's not psychotic. He knows the differences between right and wrong.
See, the biggest thing that I disagree with is the emotional disease.
But again, you have to remember the times. In the 80s, depression was seen as situational and not a disease of the brain. I mean, we've come a long way. I mean, all they're doing is making sure that he's competent to stand trial, and yeah, I think he is.
Okay, fair. Well, June that same year, this is investigative journalism, and I think this is the way that it should be done. So this local news reporter named Pat Mearson, we're going to go with that, raised the question on air to another reporter whether or not Donald had been responsible for other murders, which then led to an outpouring of anonymous call-ins from nurses that Donald had worked with, saying that they had information and that there was correlation, and, they were giving as much information as they could without jeopardizing their own jobs. So this led to a full-fledged media investigation by WCPO-TV, and Pat discovered that a pattern of deaths in Harvey's work schedule was incredibly like they were parallel. So apparently these nurses at the Drake Hospital had noticed an unusual incline and rise in deaths for the 7 months since Donald had actually worked there. And they did their due diligence and raised concerns to the administrators at their work at the time, but had been ordered to more or less keep quiet. So while we were kind of pointing fingers at the other hospitals, at least these nurses they had went to their higher ups and had tried to do something. So there's that.
Unfortunately, when you are a nurse, all you can do is go to the administration, and if the administration tells you to shut up and sit down and do your job, that's what you do.
Pat had all of this relevant information, all of these leads, but he couldn't put any of it on air, and I'm not sure why. Was it because it was an ongoing investigation? I don't know, but he couldn't put it on air. So he went to Whalen, which was Donald's attorney, and informed him of this big heaping dumpster pile of shit that he had. And Whalen went into straight panic mode and was like, oh, fuck, I got to get my client a plea bargain. Otherwise, he gonna get the death sentence and he's going to die. He didn't consider the insanity plea because Donald didn't want it. But regardless, I can't remember if we've ever talked about this, but it's something that reigns true. When you are a court-appointed attorney, when you are an attorney, you don't always get the clients who are the innocent good guys. Just as every doctor has a responsibility to give their patients the best care they possibly can and preserve their life, it's the same thing with an attorney. An attorney, no matter if they're representing a bad guy or a good guy, their number one goal is to preserve their client's life.
People will criticize criminal defense attorneys. And the way I've seen it put by criminal defense attorneys is to say it's not their job to try to necessarily clear their client's name, especially if they know they're guilty, but to make sure that the state isn't abusing their power and that their client is getting the most constitutionally sound trial and sentence that there is. Because as we know, police and the state aren't always ethical in the way they go about their investigations. They sometimes fudge things that shouldn't be there. So,
our attorneys need to exist to protect our constitutional rights, whether or not we agree with the fact that they are preserving the life sometimes of these terrible, awful people. Regardless, if they failed to do a good job, if that was your attorney when you were an innocent man and they thought that you were guilty and they didn't do what they are designed and here to do, then you could die. An innocent man.
And we know that innocent people are put to death. And we know that innocent people are put into prison for things that they didn't do. We know that happens.
It's their job, and no matter how evil the person is that they're defending, I will never hold it against them for protecting our constitutional rights. So
yeah, I agree.
I just wanted to tap it. God, we're covering all the juicy stuff with this one dude. Holy shit.
Wayland managed to finagle a plea bargain requiring a confession to all the murders that Donald had committed, but in return, removing the possibility of the death penalty. So this was contingent on Donald detailing all the murders, and if he left anything out or anyone out, it was off the table. On August 21st of 1987, at age 35, Donald Harvey was indicted on 29 counts of murder. He was sentenced to 3 consecutive life sentences for a total of 60 years. His attorney made it immensely clear that if he admitted to any more murders, he is a quote-unquote dead man. But of course, it didn't end there.
Now, there's a lot of legal proceedings and information that comes out in this time, and Harvey would go on to confess to 87 murders. However, he was only convicted of 36 in total and 1 intentional manslaughter. And that was it. I mean,
he killed a lot of people, was only convicted for 36 of them, and was supposed to serve 3 life sentences, which amounted to 60 years, which doesn't really seem like a lot, especially when he's only 35. But we do see some prison justice here. On March 28th of 2017, authorities reported that Harvey had been found in his cell severely beaten. He died on March 30th, 2017, and on May 3rd, 2019, fellow inmate James Elliott was charged with aggravated murder and other charges related to the death of Donald Harvey.
So even though he was convicted for less than half of the murders that he admitted to, should we ever applaud prison justice? Is that wrong? I don't know. What do you rate him on our Dahmer scale?
Oh, God. He's a rough one for me because he just killed so many people.
In horrible ways. He killed them in horrible ways.
He's a solid 8.5, 9 for me.
I'm going to go with 9 out of 10.
Yeah, I'm pretty much right there with you, 8.5 to 9. He tortured people. I mean, using a female catheter on a male patient.
And then shoving a fucking hanger up it?
Yeah, like that is absolutely atrocious. Letting people suffocate on their own fluids or turning their oxygen down is diabolical. And I think he is a garbage human and,
got what he deserved.
Yeah, I agree.
Palate cleanser. This is our palate cleanser. Forensic Files narrator. And then he left his fingerprints on the doorknob. Me eating my 5th mozzarella stick. You absolute fucking idiot.
Yeah, we've seen that one. This is one that I've seen a couple times and I love it. And it's an advertisement for a carpet cleaner. And it says, no stain, no murder.
The most self-control I show in life is not Googling the name of the subject of the murder doc I'm watching while I'm watching it. Isn't that true?
Netflix. Don't watch the Ted Bundy tapes alone. Me watching alone. And it's that picture of Michael Jackson eating the popcorn.
Oh my God. Chelsea. I got a Jeffrey Dahmer one.
Oh, let's hear it.
If you die while making food in a slow cooker, whoever finds your body will have a nice warm meal waiting for them. Jeffrey Dahmer. They can also eat what is ever in the slow cooker too. Here's a picture of Oscar the Grouch and it says, just because you're trash doesn't mean you can't do great things. It's called a garbage can, not a garbage cannot. I love that takeout means food, dating, and murder.
Yes,
If you're a praying mantis, it can be all 3 at once.
Oh no.
I feel like we haven't even done a Carol Baskins thing, so I almost want to sing the song.
Carol
Baskins. Killer husband whacked him.
Can't tell me that it didn't
happen. Carol Baskin.
Oh, you missed a part. Fed him to tigers, they snacking. This was happening. Carol Baskin. Oh, it's that image from American Psycho where he's holding the axe. And it says, yeah, just turn around. I'm not going to murder you, I swear.
Oh, God. Hail Satan, rain Satan, snow Satan. Tomorrow there's a 90% chance of precipitating. It'll be foggy in the morning, lots of condensating.
Oh my God.
Why is that so funny?
Hold on, now I gotta go down a rabbit hole of satanic memes. Hang on.
Oh, God.
We touched on Satanism, so let's just do it. Oh, where's the one I sent you yesterday?
How to murder. Step 1. You put the knife right in, you take the knife right out, you take the knife back in, and you twist it all about. You do the hokey pokey, and he's probably really dead. Oh,
okay, here's a good one. It says, hello, friends. This is Satan. I'm here to remind you that plagues, great floods, and pandemics are God's department. I just do orgies and metal bands.
All right, guys, that concludes this week's episode. That was some fucking bullshit. If you like our bullshit, please follow us on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter at The Killer T. We did actually make a TikTok, but we haven't posted anything on it yet. We did not get TikTok in time to get at The Killer T, so you will have to look us up at The Killer T Pod. But, you know, potato, it's fine.
We'll still be on the TikTok doing the millennial things. So.
Yeah. Once we can get back together, I mean, maybe we'll do some TikTok-y stuff as, you know, separate people, but I doubt it.
Yeah. Maybe. I mean, Monday I do have to look like an actual professional adult. So maybe I'll do a TikTok since I'll look, you know, like a human and not a corpse.
Yeah. If you guys haven't checked out the true crime rabbit hole on TikTok where there's lots of funny memes, you're really missing out.
Definitely go down that rabbit hole. It's a good rabbit hole to fall down.
All right, y'all. Until next time. Bye.
Bye.
Join us on the next episode where we discuss Israel Keys.
The most diabolical.